Those of you who are just coming on now, if you would please go ahead and introduce yourselves in the chat, really appreciate it. My name is Andrea Sladakolsky, and I'm a contractor with the Firstborn Model Office at Santa Fe Community College. And prior to that, I was the program director for the Firstborn program in Santa Fe County for about 3 years. And today, you all know you're here to hear Rebecca Riley speak, and we're really excited to have her with us today. Before I introduce her, just a couple of quick things. So we know, first of all, that home visiting programs across the state are serving families with diverse cultural traditions. Firstborn visits families in Alamo, in Zuni, in several pueblos north of Santa Fe, and on the Navajo Nation. And today, Rebecca is going to be speaking to us about home visiting as a way to return to Indigenous family support. So before I tell you all about how wonderful Rebecca is, just a few housekeeping things. You guys probably know and have experienced Zoom can be glitchy. If for some reason you lose the connection, or if for some reason the whole thing shuts down, just know that we will restart using the same link. So please log back in using the same link. A couple of other things. Please watch your email for links from us if you want to watch today's session again, because as I said, we are recording all of the sessions this week and we're emailing them out to anybody who's registered for each session. So you'll be getting lots of emails from me. Also, if you'd like to find out about the trainings that we offer to home visiting professionals around the state, and watch your email for links if you are interested in hearing about job opportunities, specifically with the Firstborn Model Office, jobs that can be done primarily remotely. So we welcome applicants from across the state. Mari's gonna, if you could drop some links into the chat where you can get more information on Firstborn and signing up for our newsletter and liking us on Facebook. So those links are there in the chat. So again, welcome. And let me tell you a little bit about Rebecca Riley. So Rebecca is a citizen of the Pueblo of Acoma. She's a mother of 3 children, and she resides with her partner in Albuquerque with their blended family of 7. She currently works as a facilitator and a consultant with various local and state early childhood education groups, in which she draws from her direct experience as a parent recipient of early childhood services in early intervention and childcare, her Acoma traditional upbringing, and formal training working for programs like tribal home visiting over the past decade. I've had the tremendous good fortune to work with Rebecca in a few different areas and on a few different projects, and I'm really excited to hear her speak today. She has dedicated herself to improving the quality of home visiting and other early childhood education services with Native American families. She received her degree from the University of New Mexico in community health education with a minor in Native American studies. And today her passion continues to develop through mindful, responsive, equitable, and inclusive practices that are reflective of family and community goals. She continues to participate on various advisory councils and committees at both local, state, and national levels. We're really grateful to Rebecca for sharing her thoughts and her wisdom with us today. If there's time at the end of her talk, we will have a few minutes for Q&A. But just in case, if you have questions as we go along, drop them in the chat and I will keep track of them, because if we don't have time for Q&A, because she's got a lot to talk to us about, that way she can make sure to get back to you with answers about your questions as we go through. So at this point, I'm going to put myself on mute and I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca.
Thank you, Andrea. I really appreciate that introduction. Hopa, greetings, everyone. It's really good to be here with you all today, and thank you so much for joining with me virtually as we take time out of our day to celebrate home visiting together. I first just want to real quickly thank Firstborn for inviting me to share during your symposium. It really is an honor to be able to present and connect with all of you. So I'm going to begin by sharing the slides here. You should be seeing a screen with the title of today's session up here shortly. All right. Can you see the slide? Okay, great. So for the next 30 minutes or so, I invite you all to explore the concept of home visiting from an Indigenous perspective, to think of home visiting as a historical community practice that continues today here in New Mexico, and to briefly learn about how colonialism in America has impacted community practices like the concept of the home visitor, and how it affects how we work with families today, especially those of tribal nations. But first, I would invite you all to think of a family tradition, something that is of some significance to you personally. One of the easiest traditions I can think of right now might be something like birthdays or other celebrations that mark transition of life along the continuum. Another example might be a tradition of a yearly camping trip where time is spent with family. Or maybe another family tradition has been more of a personal experience. For example, your caregiver teaching you something about something they were taught by their caregiver. Just take a minute to think about it and think about why maybe that tradition or personal experience was significant to you. Did you learn something, or maybe it changed you in some way? Whatever comes to mind, set it aside for the time being, because we're going to come back to that example in a while, but I'll give you a minute to kind of capture an example. Okay. Home visiting and the home visitor. Words and terms that the majority of us on here today are probably pretty familiar with, right? And you might even have been asked before this question about what words or phrases come to your mind when you think of home visiting or the home visitor. I invite you all at this time to also share words or phrases in the chat while I read through some examples. One that immediately comes to my mind is a trusted individual. I know enough about who is coming to my home to let them come in and to talk with them. I think of home visiting. When I think of home visiting, I think of the word intentional or maybe expected, meaning home visitors are there for a reason, and the family we are visiting has a reason as well. There are degrees of expectations, maybe by both caregiver and home visitor. Maybe the word planned comes to mind. Sometimes it's a date and a time, and for others, there may be a planned activity. It's maybe individualized. We adapt, we accommodate, tailor, enhance, supplement, etc. with each family, with each visit, with each child, and so on. For me, a home visitor or program can specialize in a set of skills and can also carry certain knowledge aspects in their approach or delivery of home visiting. Sometimes home visiting focuses on young caregivers or families in the NICU, or even services like early intervention. Other words or phrases might come to mind is that it's goal or purpose oriented. There's a place the family wants to get to in their parenting, or because they are processing maybe a challenge in their life. It might be facilitated or based on the quality of relationships, or relationship focused. And many, many more words we can use to describe these two things. What I observe most of the time in home visiting, especially when I facilitate the New Mexico Home Visiting Collaborative meetings, I see more often than not consensus of what we think home visiting is rather than disagreements of what it is not. Which tells us that even if we are delivering home visiting in different ways, there are still connecting and withstanding foundational home visiting values we all share among each other. So if you've shared some words that come to your mind in the chat, think of those. Think of all the words that come to mind and the words that we could probably spend a whole day thinking of. But I'm going to share with you an image that also comes to my mind when I think of home visiting and home visitor. This is a picture of a Native woman from the Pueblo of Taos in 1905, but it is also an image that is recognizable and seen in today's Pueblos in New Mexico. For tribes of New Mexico, like those of the Pueblos, and before European contact, there existed many forms of family support through designated roles within the community and among tribal members. Some examples I'll be highlighting here. For those who have worked with families of tribes, you might already be aware or even heard of examples of pre-colonial roles of support among Indigenous tribes. And by Indigenous tribes, I mean any Indigenous person from other parts of the world as well. The most familiar that comes to mind is the role of midwife, or a person who specializes in the skills and knowledge of the birthing process. Another example that is still practiced today is the role of mediators or counselors. These may be roles held within the family, like an elder or oldest sibling who could facilitate issues and challenges among family members. Sometimes these were also tribal leadership roles held among groups or designated positions. There is also the example of clanship or kinship caregiving. These extended relatives provided additional resources, information, and assistance that was intentional based on what was needed or requested within the tribe. Other examples can also be included are ceremonial and social practices fostered and focused on relationships and connections to all aspects of life and each other. And finally, the role of healers and medicine people. The role of healer or medicine man or woman, I believe, was the first home visitor of Indigenous people. This person's role exemplified the trusted individual who visited another person's home, in their home, and came with an intention, a plan, and individualized their services according to the person's concerns. These designated people also had specialized skill sets and knowledge based, facilitated the goal and purpose of the visit, and was centered on relationships, both spiritually, physically, socially, and emotionally. So since before European contact, many Western ways of thinking or practice, roles like these existed. Does that sound familiar? So in a sense, Indigenous communities have a claim on the foundational practice of home visiting as traditional practice. So therefore, home visiting really is tradition. It existed beyond what any of us understand about it today. And if we think about the many, many other New Mexico cultures and traditions who hold the same belief, the same practice, home visiting really is our New Mexico tradition. So if we know what existed before, what happened, why did things change? And more importantly, why is it important for us to be aware about those changes? Now, it is not my intention to give a history lesson on colonialism and federal policy in America. We just don't have enough time to delve deeper here. But what I do want to bring to your attention is how this timeline ultimately shows how colonialism and federal policy has had impacts and in most aspects, harmful impacts to the aspects of Native traditional home visiting practices. During this era of the 14 and 1500s was really the first European contact that occurred here in America. And one of those early contacts happened in New Mexico. An estimated 30 million indigenous people are believed to have been living in the Americas at that time. And the doctrine of discovery really catapulted the sense of what we see are the effects of colonialism today. In the 16 and 1700s is really an era of colonization where you have European, here in New Mexico, European conquistadors really making efforts to settle and establish settlements all along the Rio Grande, but also in other parts of America, we see that the efforts to establish the colonies and to stake claim happened most expediently. And with that, we also experienced here in New Mexico the effects of Spanish warfare, the introduction of disease, sometimes even genocides, which means the really the obliteration of many tribes that once existed before that are no longer in existence today, and at such a faster rate here in the 1700s. New Mexico has also had a history of slavery with Native people, mainly being mainly being located down south, and there are definitely historical records of the trade routes also being places where slavery also occurred along those historical trade routes. But you also see the creation of treaties, and one of the first treaties here in New Mexico were created with the Pueblos. And we'll see a little bit more about how those treaties transformed and developed and also changed throughout the course of history. And really what drives this is the notion of what we may all have learned about in, 8th grade history or high school history about manifest destiny, this need to explore, and that it's the right of people who are coming from another land, that it is their right to explore and to colonize areas that seem to be inhabited. As we move through the 1800s, we also see the formation of federal policy. And in this federal policy, we see that it encourages the removal of Native people from their homelands. And what occurs is more or less forced removal from reservations. And you'll see that amongst many different tribes that have a history of being displaced from their ancestral homelands and are now currently today in areas that are not their original homelands. We also see the creation of boarding schools, and there's an estimated population at this time that has lowered now to 250,000 in America. Here in New Mexico, we also experienced the effects of the Mexican War. And at the end of that war in 1848, Pueblos become one of the first US citizens of America. In the 18 and 1900s, we see a number of acts, and I'm not going to go through each of what these policies are, but really encourage you that if the understanding of history and how the history or policy has impacted tribes here in New Mexico really do stem from the creation of these acts, including the 1924 Indian Citizenship Act. Even though in 1848, Pueblo people became US citizens, that did not necessarily was true for other tribes in New Mexico. And because of the Citizenship Act, it did not guarantee that Native people could vote. So in 1924, Americans become UN citizens, and also, but did not include the right to vote until a little bit later. And so the efforts for assimilation was really to try to, through federal policy, try to have Native people leave and kind of do away with traditional practice and conform more to a Western society, Western way of thought. And so what's really amazing is that this is one of the very few examples where the United States has actually made this law, and those laws still exist today. Now we arrive to the 1900s, and what becomes, I think, really relevant here is kind of this beginning of Native people and tribes being seen as not only just a category of race and ethnicity, but also being identified as people having dual citizenship. We are one of the only groups here in America that hold dual citizenship, meaning our citizenship from our tribes is equal to that of the United States citizenship. And that was during this time being efforts by the US government being looked at as something that was both a threat and something that was to be terminated. And so there, in 1945, policy was attempted to be in place to terminate Native American citizenship. And in relation to that, also efforts to relocate Native people, even though there were times when Native people were forcibly removed earlier in the 1800s from the reservations, there were efforts to also put programs in place to relocate Native people to urban areas. And an example of that is through the railroad constructions through major cities. So the railroads acted as an avenue to relocate Native people to major cities that were far away from their ancestral lands. But through all these challenges, you also see the emergence of self-determination, self-governance, and the exercise of sovereignty amongst tribes, and not just by one tribe, but many tribes coming together to exercise their rights, and also questioning the harms that were being done by all of these previous federal policies that were in place. So then in 1948, you see Native people in New Mexico can finally vote, even though they gained citizenship much earlier than this. So here we are to the 1900s. I'm gonna move ahead. Here we are to the 2000s in the present day, and you really see this, I think, just evolution and development of Native people and tribes really making efforts, and also in continuity of exercising sovereignty, reclaiming, revitalizing, and repairing and reconciliating efforts to try to undo and hold the US government accountable for some of the harms that were done through federal policy. And you see these through efforts like language revitalization, efforts to exercise data sovereignty, meaning tribes really having a control on how data is collected, how it's used and interpreted when it's collected from tribal people. You also see this in research and evaluation through Indigenous methodologies, approaches and practices. You see the arrival of tribal critical race theory, in which we start to gain more understanding of how colonialism has really affected health inequities throughout history. And also, I think this really great return to Indigenous practice and wisdom through efforts like truth and reconciliation. And one of the examples of that you see today is bringing awareness to the issues of the effects of boarding schools amongst Native children and families. So as you can see, or maybe even begin to realize, that the history of colonization and federal policy is not merely a timeline of events for Native people, but a history of what is understood as a period of disruption in tribal parenting practices. Regis Pecos, native to New Mexico, a citizen of the Pueblo of Cochiti, and a highly respected Native American leader who has worked in state government for 30 years, has talked on a number of policy issues affecting Native people and has often described colonialism as a disruption of ancestral knowledge. So we begin to start to see shifts in beliefs and transitions over time. We also see the dehumanization and systemic racism in federal policies that were put in place. And we also are experiencing and seeing the devaluing of tribal parenting practices and as not being valid, not being evidence-based. I think, we throw that word around a lot, but this a westernized way of thinking is actually contributing to how Native people have, I think, just over time tried to again revitalize and reclaim all those things that we've known beforehand to be good and I think positive for parenting families who are Native people. And so, when we see throughout the period of colonialism, the Native understanding and practice of parenting changes, we really do see changes happening, and that with these changes came harmful consequences Native people are still experiencing and overcoming today. And you see this through a number of health disparities. We see this in even in the practice of home visiting, how generations of families may have challenges with even processing or thinking about what does parenting mean to them in the sense of the traditional sense. So it's good to be aware of not just the current historical issues or the current issues, but also the historical issues that have led us to this point, that have we've come to arrive, not just by happenstance, that this really is been from a continuation of all of these things that were put in place at the time of European contact. So I like to emphasize, and you probably have seen images similar to this and maybe in the media or in other presentations before, but this is a picture of 4 Pueblo children from Zuni who arrived at Carlisle boarding school in Pennsylvania. And this is a before and after picture. And it's just a stark reminder of, what families and children were going through at the time, and what were, makes you think like how and what were the thoughts and feelings and emotions that were experienced, and how would that affect even just kind of communities as a whole. So this, this example didn't just happen to one family, it happened to whole populations all across America. So I want you to think back on that example of your family tradition. And now you might want to imagine, what if that family tradition was taken away? What would it change things? If, for example, if birthdays never existed, how would it shape you differently? Would it shape you in a different way than how you've imagined birthdays now? What moments, meanings, lessons, and teachings would be forever changed if a significant tradition all of a sudden stopped? Would something else replace it? Would you seek to find it again, and at what cost? Would you still feel you had a connection to something that existed before? And are these traditions you would miss or try to save? And what you have now, How far would you go to protect something that you loved or that held meaning to your life and to future grandchildren? And so despite the impacts of colonialism, Native parenting practices and home visiting traditions have also endured. And if we are to continue to provide home visiting services to Native families and communities, it is imperative to our work to also be aware of the historical aspects of the populations we serve, because those impacts are still being experienced by people today. So because of what we know now, and I'm sure, you know, the information that I've shared kind of, these are really big and broad, large pieces of, you know, just a little bit of what was in that timeline. But when you go deeper into looking at how policies came about, how these systems were built, we have to ask ourselves, so now what? We're in the present day. How does this change things? But because early childhood developed from a westernized system, we have to acknowledge that. And that system that we are all a part of and we participate, including myself, did not include Native early childhood perspectives. We have to work to address the inequities that may exist and do exist when we do participate and implement programs like home visiting. So how do we do that? Well, we work to address inequity in early childhood through home visiting. And I believe that we are already doing that in many different ways. And we are doing that every single time that we are visiting a family in their home. One of the most, I think, tangible and easy things to think about of how to do this is that we work to establish trust through relationship-based practices. We're already doing that. And now we need to think about how we're going to continue that and protect that aspect of home visiting. Establishing trust is ongoing and has to extend beyond the home visit sometimes. How are we entrusting or how are we establishing trust through our programming and processes? Are we establishing trust when we're picking up the phone and taking that referral? How are we doing that? How are we maintaining that trust when we might make mistakes, and that's going to happen? How are we going to put practices in place to promote repair and address when we have made those mistakes? Another way we can do that is to create community or support community where it already exists. I believe at this time, between 8 and 10% of Native people make up the New Mexico population, and the most represented tribe in Albuquerque right now is Lakota. For Native people who are far from their ancestral homelands and have made New Mexico their home, how are we connecting them? How are we connecting them with and who? And for communities that already exist, how are we supporting it? For example, are we being flexible when tribes are closed because of ceremonies? One thing I like to ask with home visitors who are serving tribes or Native people, how many of them have their the social calendar, right? Here in New Mexico with the Pueblos, we have feast days. And, it's one of the things that we have to have an awareness about, because those things are very important to the communities. And also understanding what the tribal protocols are for home visitors that are serving tribal populations. How many of us know the laws and protocols of non-Native people visiting on tribal lands? We have to start working with a lens, or maybe we already are working with a lens where multi-generational and multicultural ways of living is a strength. So when we're thinking about serving families in the home and we see multiple generations, when I first started in home visiting, 11, 10 years ago, Having many people in the home was looked at as a negative aspect. It was being promoted as not a strength to that family to have the grandparents, the uncles, the aunts, and the cousins in a home, when traditionally speaking, this is how we lived before, and that was our protective factors. How are we looking at serving Native people, Native families who come from many different cultures? Now you see more so families that are not just from one tribe, but they are affiliated with many different tribes. And sometimes those conversations on our identity can be, interesting and challenging both the same, because Native people themselves are still making those connections that have been disrupted in the past. We also need to listen and acknowledge all experiences and work to understand that one voice does not speak for all, but all voices are heard. An example of that is, especially now that we see the momentum gaining around including family voice in advisory councils and committees, we also want to take note that putting individuals in a place to make decisions on behalf of speaking for a whole population is usually not appropriate. There's ways that we can look to support that family voice as their individual voice. And then we have to kind of work in different ways to seek how, if we are looking for an official decision or official participation in including tribal governments. Now that takes a lot, kind of more of a concerted effort. But when we're looking at aspects of equity, we really do need to go through those processes and protocols to seek out who really can speak on behalf of a tribe, and what does that mean, because tribes are wanting to participate, and we have to assist and support them on what makes the most sense for their participation to be meaningful. And finally, we all need to really advocate for system transformation and changes that are harmful, or make it challenging for groups of people who have been historically impacted by colonization in America. And this just doesn't affect Native people. If we're serving African American communities, how has colonization affected that population? If we are serving a certain group where a policy has been based on race or ethnicity, we need to pay attention to how those policies and how our participation in those policies are not further harming or causing inequities. And so it takes a little bit of, I think, of an awareness, because it's not always apparent to us when those injustices are happening. Some of them are very blatant, and it's easy to call them out. It's easy to bring attention, but some of them may not be, right in our face and tell us, this is wrong. And so it's even more important why we have to involve those communities that are being most impacted, and to really carefully listen about what the solutions are and ensure that those solutions are implemented, so that we don't see that these inequities continue. An example of that is really, I think relevant today with the effects of COVID and what we're learning about COVID. It really brought to light a lot of various issues that have been in existence for hundreds of years. I remember when I was learning about, how COVID was impacting the Navajo Nation, and just finding it interesting how many people were surprised by the fact that Navajo Native people were living without water. And it was like, yes, that has been happening, and it's happened in many different areas in the Southwest. And so, but how many of us have really listened to that and make concerted efforts to change law so that every family has running water? So we have a long ways to go, but I feel like we're really having these discussions and thinking about these things at a really good time, in our history, because a lot of effort is being done to make those changes. So my last slide, and I'm looking at the time here because we're coming up to about 2:45 here. I just wanted to share just some few last thoughts, and really encourage that all of you who work in home visiting and working with Native families, or really any community or Indigenous community, that families and communities really have the answers. And this quote by Abigail Echo Hawk, quote on equity really, really kind of like drives the point that when we're undertaking any efforts toward achieving health equity among American Indian and Alaska Native people, come to Indigenous people because we have the answers, not because you think we have the most problems. It really speaks a lot in her article on Indigenous health equity about the perspectives of Native people and how Native people view health, because some aspects of that have been ignored. And she really calls attention to how we can be more inclusive of Native voices in changing health disparities. And the last one really resonated with me as a Native woman, as a Native parent, as a Native caregiver, in learning about the historical impacts of policy and just, I think in the course of history here in New Mexico, I learned a lot when I went to the University of New Mexico when I was in Native American Studies, and just being, really surprised about the information that I didn't know about, that I didn't get to learn about in school. And it really brings about the point as a Native person that we have to be the parent colonialism never wanted us to be. In the history, in US history, it's been repeated several times to try to really erase Native culture from America. And it's hard to say that sometimes, it's hard to speak about it sometimes, but that's part of the truth and reconciliation processes that Native people are seeking for, and how we can address the injustices that have happened. So I just wanted to leave some resources and my contact. If you have any questions, I will try to get to all of your questions and send you a message. But I found that these resources are really helpful, and they have links to other places that can provide additional strategies and approaches that I've used in my time with tribal home visiting. But just as a reminder, always start with local resources and knowledge on equity. Always start here at home. We have the answers. We have to tailor our ways of doing home visiting to New Mexico, because there is strength there, and we have to believe that. And we only do that by starting here locally, and scaffold that and support that with what's happening in the rest of America. So I just want to thank you all. I hope this part of the symposium was a little bit useful. And just thank you again for all of your attention today.
Rebecca, thank you so much. I really appreciated that. Just a quick reminder to everyone, if you have any questions, do drop them in the chat, and we'll save those questions, and Rebecca will get back to you on them. You've really given us a lot to think about, and shared some really important insights with us. So thank you all for coming. And one last reminder, we will send out the recording for today's session to all of you, everyone who registered. So Mari, if you could also just drop the links in the chat again, just if you want more information about upcoming trainings and other things having to do with Firstborn and the Institute, then you can sign up for our newsletter, and we can get that information out to you. And we look forward to seeing you all at other sessions during the symposium the rest of this week. Check your inbox for an email with this recording. It'll probably come out tomorrow, because there was a lot of good information there and resources. And so we want to make sure you all can listen to this again. Thank you again, Rebecca, so much. We really appreciate your time today. Have a good day, everybody.